My name is Phyllis Greenberg Heidemann, and I am privileged to serve as president of the International March of the Living. On behalf of the officers and board, I welcome each of you to tonight's program. Since its inception in 1988, the International March of the Living has led the way as torchbearers of memory. We have educated participants, their extended family, and many relationships in countries around the globe about the events of the Holocaust, the realities of unchecked anti-Semitism and intolerance, and the importance of learning from the past so that we may participate in ensuring a better future. Our educational programs and annual journey to Poland are legendary. We believe that the March experience has left an indelible mark on the lives of countless of participants who have participated and embraced their social responsibility to do all they can do to make a difference in this world. Today, I am pleased to welcome two March of the Living alumna, both who have taken the lessons of their March experience with them as they went on to be meaningful adult personal lives and successful professional careers. Tracy Reichman-Kalick, Esquire, born and raised in St. Louis, Missouri, attended the very first March of the Living in 1988 as the International Nasiya, the president of the B'nai B'rith Girls. BBYO has been a partner of the March ever since, and in 2018, Tracy's daughter Allie joined the BBYO delegation herself and continued her family tradition of participation and communal commitment. Today, Tracy is actively involved in BBYO adult leadership and has drawn upon learning the lessons of the Holocaust in her professional life, as she is a highly accomplished attorney, heavily engaged in human rights activism. Dafna Michaelson Jenet, born and raised in Israel, attended the 1990 March as a teenager. As an adult, Dafna later accompanied 3 additional journeys as staff, and following her graduation from Stern College, she continued her commitment to our wonderful March mission through her position on the Board of Jewish Education in New York. Dafna's connection to the Holocaust and the importance of memory stems deeply from her family's loss of 56 members of her mother's family and countless more on her paternal side. Now an esteemed third-term member of the Colorado House of Representatives, Dafna successfully introduced a landmark bill requiring the completion of a Holocaust and Genocide study in order to receive your high school diploma. We are proud of the impact that the International March of the Living has had on these two illustrious alumni, these two highly accomplished women, and I am very honored to introduce each of them to you today. But first, of course, we must get to the administrative matters of this webinar. So I ask that you place your questions in the Q&A. Place any questions you may have for either Tracy or Dafna, and they will be addressed at the end of the following conversation. Before I turn the program over, I want to thank you for joining us this evening. Hope this finds you and your families well, and take a moment to personally invite each of you to join us on the 2022 March of the Living in April. I hope you will continue to follow us at motl.org.
Well, hello, everybody. I am Dafna Michaelson Jenet, and it is such an honor to be able to spend some time with you today. I have to tell you, I remember clearly, I was at regional convention. I was part of the Kentucky, Indiana, and Ohio region of BBYO. And it was our regional convention in Indianapolis when they showed, right after Shabbos, they showed a video of Tracy's year of March of the Living, of this thing. And they said they were going to send 2 BBYO representatives from every region. And there was going to be an application and there was going to be a scholarship and all of these things. And she's talking, she being the regional director is talking, and I'm slowly moving closer and closer and closer to her in the room. And by the time she was done talking, I said to her, I have to have one of these scholarships. I have to have one of these scholarships. And I remember writing the application. I wish I had a copy of it. And then calling the region office every single day. Have you made your decision yet? Hi, this is Dafna. Did you make your decision yet? Hey, it's Dafna calling. Did you make your decision yet? And eventually they said that they had made their decision and that I was going to get to have one of the scholarships. Without that scholarship, I never would have been able to go. And saying that it changed the trajectory of my life it isn't giving enough value to the experience that I had. I remember we started to gather together there were other groups from Cincinnati that were going. And so myself and another BBYO person hung out with we called it CAGE, with the Central Agency of Jewish Education people. And we were learning all about what were the different components that we needed to be prepared for the March of the Living. And I mean, it was unreal to me. I couldn't believe that I was going to get to have this experience. And we get to Poland. It's finally, the time has come, and we land in Poland. And for the life of me, I will never understand why, but I went numb. I couldn't feel anything the entire time I was in Poland. And all around me, my friends are crying and experiencing and feeling, and I'm like numb. And I don't know why. And I can't figure it out. And, you know, I still have my journal. They encouraged us to journal, and it started my own journal practice, actually, journaling practice. So I look through my journal and I'm questioning, like, okay, I haven't cried once. Like, I don't understand what is wrong with me. And finally, it's time to go to Israel. And we are on the plane and we come into Tel Aviv at night. And I remember seeing the shoreline all lit up. And that's when I finally was able to cry. And it had taken me all of that time to be able to get to a point where I could actually feel the overwhelming, unbelievable feelings of being in this place, of having stood on the ground where my own family members perished. It took me until I felt safe in Israel to finally be able to cry. I tell you all of that because it stuck with me my entire life. And one of the things that I remember as a responsibility of having been given this scholarship through BBYO was I agreed that I would talk to different school groups. I would talk to different community centers. I went to a whole bunch of churches that I kept sending me around everywhere to talk about Holocaust education. And that was part of what our job was, to make sure that our generation, for sure, didn't forget about what happened during the Holocaust. And that mission stuck with me my whole life. My first professional job out of college, I was director of the Holocaust Awareness Institute at the University of Denver. And I remember sitting there, I was in my 20s, early 20s, one of the youngest Holocaust Education Center directors in the country at the time, if not the youngest. And I remember sitting there and the board of directors was discussing, wouldn't it be wonderful if there was a Holocaust education mandate in Colorado? And then everybody said, no, that's not something, that we can't do that. That's never going to happen. Well, never say never. It might have taken me another 20 years to get there. But as a state representative, I am very honored to say that in the session 2 years ago, we finally passed a piece of legislation that, as you heard from Phyllis, you must have Holocaust and genocide education in order to be able to graduate from high school in Colorado. It was not an easy path, and it took it took 30 years of people dreaming about it before we got there, but we're finally there, and the conversations are deep. And the reason we got there is because the Armenian community stepped up and said, we're going to help carry this water with you. And they helped us carry it to the finish line. So I'm honored that I was in the legislature at the right time, that I was able to carry this piece of legislation, that I was moved to change my entire life. I mean, I imagine it changed. Who knows what my trajectory was at 17 years old, but the Holocaust became my life, and a thriving, happy, committed to the community life, and it's because of March of the Living. So I'm really honored to be here and looking forward to the conversation with Tracy.
I appreciate you being here. I'm looking forward to our conversation as well. We have a lot in common, as Phyllis mentioned in her introduction of us. Most of all, our love and passion for March of the Living, and of course, our mutual background in BBYO. And I was wondering, you said you were like motivated when you saw those first presentations, which were probably done by me and at least the initial pictures and things. And I was wondering, were you always interested in the Holocaust? Was this something that you as a youth were interested in?
Yeah, I remember being at my grandmother's house and finding all of the books, right? So whatever books had been out at that time, I started reading about the Holocaust when I was about 7 years old. And, you know, learning about it in school, learning about it through books and stories. And then my uncle, who made Aliyah, he's the one who has created this family tree where we have this list of 56 people we know perished in the Holocaust just on that one side of the family, one side of the family. But we were all from Eastern Europe. Although I am 13th generation Israeli on my maternal grandmother's side.
So when did you come to the United States?
I was a baby, 6 months old.
6 months old, okay. And so as you know, someone who is not born here, did you experience, you know, growing up, what you saw as like anti-Semitism or anti-Zionism, and was that something that formulated your sort of early visions of all this?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. So in my early years, we lived in Philadelphia and New York, which have, as you probably know, very large Jewish populations. But when I was about 12 years old, we moved to Cincinnati, Ohio. And there I was the first time that I recognized that I experienced anti-Semitism, that people didn't understand who and what we were. I remember just after we had moved in to our house in Cincinnati, we needed to call a plumber. And the plumber came to the house, and my Abba, who wears a kippah, opened the door. And, you know, the guy came in and he just, you know, okay, went about his business. And then as he's leaving, he looks at my father and he says, "You folk Jews?" And my father says, my Abba says, "Well, yes, we're Jewish." And he says, where's y'all's horns and tails?" And I had never heard that before, never in my life. And I had no idea what he was talking about. And, you know, for my Abba to have to then explain to me, okay, well, this is an anti-Semitic trope and this is that and the other thing, like I'm barely bat mitzvah, right? And I started to understand that there were people who didn't understand us, who feared us, or who thought that we didn't exist. And it was actually, you know, a part of my requirement to take the scholarship was, as I mentioned, talking in schools. And the first school I spoke in was my own. And I went to a very interesting high school that was 4th through 12th grade. So it was a performing arts high school, but it was a big spread. So we were all 4th through 12th grade in the black box theater. I remember clearly. And I had my little slide tray and my slide projector, and I went slide by slide and talked about my whole experience. And at the end, I opened up for questions, and this little girl in the front raises her hand, and she said, "But I thought all the Jews were dead."
Mm.
And I said, "Well, I'm Jewish." And she said, "Yeah, but I thought all the Jews were dead." And I said, "No, we're not dead. There's a thriving Jewish community." And I have to tell you, that experience stuck with me so much that when we were working on the legislation, if you read our legislation, it talks about also introducing the experience of Jewish settlers in Colorado and the thriving community that we have in Colorado. Because if we're only talking about the Holocaust in a vacuum, maybe if you're in the middle of America and you're not surrounded by Jewish communities, maybe you believe that all the Jews are dead. And that was game changing for me.
Yeah, I can believe that. And I know that when I remember when I was out speaking as a youth and explaining, and I was more with, adult boards and trying to recruit people to give the scholarships that were so important to, future generations to be able to go. That was a big part of it. So I want to take you back to your first March of the Living, and then actually you went on to staff it. So what years did you staff March of the Living?
98, 99, and 2000.
Right. And so how was your experience as a staff member different than when you went, as one of those first participants?
Oh my goodness. It's different when you're responsible for 3 busloads of 250 New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and a sprinkling of Colorado teenagers whose lives are in your hands. And I really loved the education components that we did beforehand. I loved being a part of that. And I loved just being there to see and experience with them through their eyes. It was my last trip, I think it was 2000 that my sister, it was definitely 2000, and my sister came on as a student participant. And it was just such a powerful experience to watch her daven in Poland. And I can see her standing there right now. She's still very, very connected to Torah and Midos, and she just wanted to make sure that she was davening every single, Shachris, Mincha, Marav. She was on time. And it was the kind of intention, the kind of kavana that I was able to see through her that gave me that, kind of back view of how important this experience is for every single person, whether you're a participant, whether you're a survivor, whether you're a staff member. It changes you every single time.
Right. I mean, I sort of talk about it as like the profound moment. And to be able to witness well, first to experience it yourself, and then to witness it, I can only imagine as a staff member or, someone who is charged with taking our youth, that it must have been a very profound moment again for you.
Incredibly, incredibly profound.
And of course, that's what we hope Holocaust education does, whether it be in Auschwitz or in the classroom in Colorado, that it gives people that sense of like, oh my goodness. And so I just applaud everything that you are doing and have been doing to bring those profound moments to so many youth, whether they participate in the march, you know, in Poland, or whether they somewhat virtually participate by their Holocaust education that they're now getting. So
thank you.
yeah. So what tools do you think that you gained as both a participant and then as a staff member on the march that helped you sort of with your public service work and advocates for Holocaust education?
You know, I'm going to throw out a word and I'm going to ask everybody to not politicize the word. Okay, the word is activism, right? There are certain things in life that trigger our activism. And I remember the day of the march, we're lined up in rows of 5 at the time. I don't know how many people are in the rows now. I think we were up to like 10 in 2000. But we were in rows of 5 and we were standing there in our blue jackets, and many of the young men decided they wanted to wear kippot, even if they were not regular kippah wearers. So we were heavily identifiable as, you know, Jewish people. Also, we had that blue jacket with the Agam Star of David on the back. I mean, like, there was no question. There was a whole bunch of Jewish kids all of a sudden on the path between Auschwitz and Birkenau. And also the community came out. Now, I don't know if this happened during your trip, Tracy, but we had people lining the route like it was a parade route, literally eating ice cream, kids with balloons. And all of a sudden, as we're walking by, this group of young kids is throwing rocks to try to knock the kippah off of the heads of the boys. And I was dumbfounded. You know, here we were so many years after the Holocaust, and I had had this hope that I was going to go to Poland and find a place where maybe it's safe to be Jewish again. Maybe it's okay to look like me, you know, and walk down the streets in Poland and feel at home. And when the boys started throwing rocks at the heads of the other boys in my group, I couldn't believe that from a very simplistic perspective, not much had changed.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, that sort of thing really, I mean, I guess everybody responds differently, but for me, it lit a fire. And I already had a little bit of a fire because BBYO is very good about fire lighting. But this was a moment where I truly understood that I have an obligation, and that part of my obligation is to try to make sure that this type of anti-Semitism does not continue to fester in the world. And unfortunately, you know, we have a very long way to go.
Yeah, for sure. And, you know, activism, and I love that word because it can mean so many different things, can happen in many different ways. One of the things I think about the march is and as you mentioned, your experience, I think some of those experiences are still happening when participants went, you know, even as recently as when my daughter went in 2018. So, you know, I think that the march does a very important thing in teaching young people on how to stand up to hate. And I was just wondering, you know, how you think greater Holocaust education does in helping our young people learn to stand up to hate.
So I'm not sure that, okay, I take that back. Definitely sure. A big part of why we passed this legislation and what we talked about is, Abe Foxman from the ADL always used to say, Auschwitz was built with words and not bricks. And one of the things that we are really trying incredibly hard to do in the Holocaust education that we are making available to students in Colorado is to teach them what leads up to this type of an action, what led to genocide, and teaching them the steps of, the Nuremberg laws and even before the Nuremberg laws, and what were the little things that happened. Why did Kristallnacht happen? What did it mean to wear the Jude on the star on your chest? And trying to help them see that there is a path that one might choose to take that can lead to very bad places. And while you may think, oh, whatever, I'm just making fun of that person, or I'm just, I just don't like that person, there's, nothing I can do about it. That we need to understand that it is through our words and it is through our relationships with people that we can stop genocide from continuing to happen. And it continues to happen in our world. And one of the things, when people were saying to me, well, the Holocaust was such a long time ago, why do we need to learn about the Holocaust? And I said, I'm pretty well convinced that until there's no more genocide on this planet, we absolutely must learn about the Holocaust. And we are not at a point where there is not that genocide and that hatred. So hopefully through the education of better use of words, maybe we'll have people standing up to poor use of language.
Did you experience a lot of resistance from your colleagues when you were first introducing the bill?
No, as a matter of fact, it passed unanimously in both chambers. So which we were very excited about. But where we were seeing or worried about some sort of resistance was, how is this going to roll out? Colorado is very much a local control state. So we have 65 school districts, and we have 65 counties, far more than that, school districts. And in each county, the school districts makes their own choices for how they are going to carry out education. So the bigger concern was that we couldn't be too prescriptive. That there was a fear that we were going to come out and say, you have to follow this curriculum, you have to teach it in this class, you have to do it, exactly as we have laid out. But instead, what we did was we developed a library and resource center where you could come, and depending on how you are going to include this in your education, you have many components from which to learn. So the trick was, how do we manage both local control and yet the understanding that we need to learn what happened there if we're going to ever come to a place where we stop it from happening again.
And I mean, you all had so much success in getting this passed. Are there other states that you know of that are considering similar legislative action to mandate genocide education like this?
There are a handful of states who have already passed it, and then we passed a federal law as well. So I think we're going to start seeing more of it. I don't know which states are working on it right now, but I foresee that other states will take up the mantle.
I know that when the bill was signed into law, you attended the signing ceremony wearing your March of the Living jacket. Can you tell me about that moment?
Well, it wasn't my jacket, because I didn't have my jacket. Now I have a jacket. I feel much better about myself. But we were given these gray bags that had all of our materials in it that said March of the Living on it, had my pin on it. I should have prepped and brought that with me tonight. But so I wore my March of the Living bag, and I felt that my 17-year-old self was very proud of that moment.
I'm sure it must have been a thrill. And so I kind of want to just turn the table a little bit and talk to you about, as you know, we've seen a rise in anti-Semitism around the country and on college campuses. And if you don't mind, I'd love to get your thoughts on the controversy that erupted in South Lake, Texas, where the school board administration indicated that because of a particular House bill that they had, teachers were supposed to, quote, provide opposing views of the Holocaust. And I know that angered and troubled a lot of us. What was your reaction when you first heard about that?
Well, I was devastated. I first posted on Facebook about our bill and about the work that we were doing in Colorado, and how I hoped that we would see more of this type of action instead of the action that we saw in Texas. But I will tell you that it's murky. The Texas scenario, I hear from some of my colleagues in Texas. I'm very involved in Hadassah, and El Paso, Texas is in my region, and I'm close to the other Texas people. And part of what they felt was it was a complete misinterpretation of the legislation. Now, I have not reviewed the legislation myself, but any legislation that assumes that there must be multiple sides to every issue is definitely, the word we would use would be overreaching, going a little bit beyond what makes sense. We know that there have been awful things that have happened in our history everywhere in the world, in our country. And to be able to say that, well, there was another side to the story, when you think about things that have happened in this country, such as annihilation of indigenous peoples in this land that we came into. It's a very challenging, slippery slope. I think that the outcome regarding Holocaust education in Texas is ultimately going to be in a place where you can have positive Holocaust, or compelling Holocaust education in Texas, but that it took that really gross interpretation of a piece of legislation and fear that someone was going to find out they were saying that Nazis were bad.
Right. I know eventually the superintendent, recanted and apologized. But one of the things I think that was very inspiring was the young man who stood up at the school board meeting. I believe his name was Jake Berman, and he talked about the anti-Semitism that he had experienced as a high school student there in South Lake. And I think that his statements to the school board definitely sort of swayed their thinking on this. Do you think that if there were more states like Colorado who were passing legislation requiring Holocaust and genocide education, that we would see less anti-Semitism?
That would be my hope. That would be my, eternal goal. We're still dealing with a tremendous amount of anti-Semitism here in Colorado, and there are a number of school districts who have been dealing with swastika graffiti and other gross forms of public anti-Semitism. So we're not, it's not gone, right? I think what's the challenge for us that we have to overcome is there's going to have to be a tipping point where enough of our kids are not experiencing anti-Semitism at home, where they're not hearing it at home, and then they're going to school and learning, oh, well, actually, somebody tried to kill all the Jews and that was a bad thing. And, you know, let's talk about why that was a bad thing. I mean, we have so much work to do. Do I think teaching about the Holocaust is going to end anti-Semitism? No, unfortunately, I think anti-Semitism is something that we are going to deal with in for our lifetimes. But what I do think teaching about the Holocaust is going to do is it's going to make people aware of the concept that there are Jews, and especially the way that we wrote it, that there are Jews that were thriving part of building the Colorado that we have today. But also understanding what vile hatred can do. And it's not only, you know, about the anti-Semitism, but it's just hatred and ignorance and bigotry, and understanding how to be able to see and recognize those behaviors in yourself or in others and what to do about it. That's what's going to tip the scales in the other direction. We have a ways to go.
Right, for sure. And I guess, you know, so obviously you're teaching about the Holocaust, but one of our community members who's been watching this was wondering also what other genocides are part of the curriculum, because I think that's an important part of this too, that it's not necessarily only a unique experience to Jewish people and the Holocaust and anti-Semitism.
Yeah, and it's a really good question. You know, in my opening remarks, I talked about being the young director of the Holocaust Awareness Institute, and one of the big concerns that the survivor community had was, well, you start talking about the Holocaust and everybody's going to want to talk about everything. And it took us a lot of years, 30 years to pass this piece of legislation, to come to a point where we have enough of a recognition that it is the story of the Holocaust is compelling and available because we have so much material. We have an endless supply of books, and thanks to the Shoah Foundation, we have an endless supply of videos and narratives and stories, and there are ways for us to consume the education around what happened. So in our bill, the Holocaust is the vehicle, if you will. We do talk about the Armenian genocide. We do talk about Native American genocide, and ultimately the recognition that there are genocidal episodes or attempts that are going on currently in different regions of the world and what those look like. So hopefully we're teaching about the Holocaust, but raising a group of kids who will determine that they don't want this to continue happening in their world.
Right. And you mentioned the Armenian community. Why do you think they were so supportive of the bill and getting it passed?
Yeah. I learned during this process that the Armenian community feels strongly that if the Armenian genocide had been stopped, the Holocaust might not have happened. And that was something I had never heard before. And it was so interesting to listen to survivors and second and third generation Armenians talk about their perspective of you know, the fact that nobody came to help them, so that it was an inevitability that the Holocaust happened, whereas it could have been stopped. And it's interesting. Obviously, we can't know, and there's no sort of if-then equation that's going to help tell us a different story. We only know the story that there is, and we know the history of what happened. So for the Armenian community, they feel very close to what happened in the Holocaust, and they very much wanted to see Holocaust education, including about the experience that happened prior to the Holocaust to the Armenian community.
Wow, that's fascinating, and to see a community embrace this so much is really, inspiring, actually. So just kind of a little bit switching gears again. So we know that not only is there anti-Semitism in, high schools, as you talked about, in your local communities, but we see it, of course, growing on college campuses, which is something, that we both are concerned about as we have children who face that every day. And so students who typically go on the march are high school seniors. But what do you think about their experience of being on the march helps them to sort of respond when they're then faced in the future with these sort of anti-Semitic experiences?
I used to talk about the before eyes and the after eyes. And this came from the staffing perspective of being on the staff of March of the Living, and doing all of the trainings and working with the high school students, and then getting to Poland and the innocence going away. Literally, you could see a shift in the eyes, and that was so palpable. And what I feel like happened is this understanding of, had we been born at a different time, in a different place, this was our story. This would have been the outcome of who we are. But we were born now. I imagine that the March of the Living song that we used to sing, that everybody else continued to sing, and the words were, "For you who died, I must live on." And I'm sorry, my dogs are getting excited in the background. For you who died, I must live on. I mean, we sang those words, whether we were standing in Majdanek or whether we were in Treblinka, whether we were in Auschwitz. We sang, "For you who died, I must live on." And I think that when you walk in the footsteps of those who perished before us, and feel that inside of your body in a way that you can only feel it when you have walked on those grounds, that you are forever changed, and that you recognize the gift that you have been given to be born now in a world now with the reflection and knowledge that we have now. And I think that gives courage to our students when they hit college and start facing some really ugly anti-Semitism on campus. I think that kids who go on the March of the Living are uniquely predisposed to be able to stand up for themselves and for the rest of our community.
So there are real, long-term benefits in building this strong sense of identity and willingness to stand up, as you say, to hatred and speak out, which I think is so important, that we train our young people to do that, because they are getting bombarded in so many different directions.
Yeah, and there are without a doubt long-term benefits for going to the march.
Yeah. So I know that there have been some people, and I'm just they're feeding me a few of these questions, so they're gonna kind of jump around a little bit on different topics. But someone was wondering if you were familiar with the California Ethnic Studies mandate, which is, I guess, very controversial there in California. It was originally terribly biased against Jews and endorsed BDS, which is a big issue, of course, as you know as well. And so someone in the community was wondering if you could speak to that at all.
I am not familiar with that piece of legislation, and I can hear the concern. And all I can say is a piece of legislation can be changed simply with another piece of legislation. And if there is legislation in your state that you feel is harmful to the Jewish community or harmful to the learning or education about the Holocaust, then it is incumbent on each of us to get in touch with our local elected officials and work on a new piece of legislation, not assume that it's a fait accompli. And also understand that legislation sometimes takes many, many years to pass. But if you're committed to fixing or changing a bad piece of legislation, it absolutely 100% can be done.
Okay. No, I think that's good advice, and I know people are very concerned about some of the ways that there have been these legislative initiatives that really take on BDS and advocate for that. So another question is, how do you monitor the type of courses that are taught in each school district and whether the school district is in fact complying with the law?
Excellent question. So what happens in laws that are education mandates in Colorado is we pass them, they get signed by the governor, and then they go to the state school board to put into action. And what ultimately happened is at the state school board, they took some really bad, they made some really bad choices. Ultimately, one of the things that they wanted to make certain was that Nazism is socialism. And so that you had to teach about socialism if you were going to teach about Nazism. And it was just very misconstrued and very poorly done. Well, the Jewish community got up in arms, and so did the Armenian community, by the way. And we've been able to work with the school board to fix what happened at that school board meeting. But as I say about much of my legislation, once I pass it, it doesn't mean I'm done working on it. We're going to have to keep paying attention and seeing how this is rolling out. And, we created a whole resource bank of materials that they could choose from. So that resource bank is what's going to make certain that quality materials are being used, materials that are truthful. So, we're making certain that the materials available are the materials we would want taught in our classes.
And are there things that this group of stakeholders, meaning the people who are here, sort of listening tonight, who are March of the Living supporters, are there things that they can do to advocate and support these efforts, either in their home states or wherever they're listening from, that you know of?
Absolutely. First of all, you should find out what sort of history mandates are required in your state, and know that if you want to add a Holocaust education component to it, you're going to need to bring the community together, understand what you're going to want, make sure that you're making resources available so that it is easy for the teachers to be able to fulfill the obligation. But at the very least, be in touch with your local elected officials and let them know that this is important to you. And it's as easy as emailing. I can say that in the Colorado legislature, the representatives and senators are very easy to get a hold of. All of our contact information is on the state legislative website. So it shouldn't be difficult for you to find your state representative. And if you want to be advocating on a little bit of a higher level, then look for your federal delegation. But real change happens at the state level. That's what I believe.
Do you know, have there been any studies, long-term studies about like when students participate in Holocaust education programs, like how that changes the situation sort of on the ground versus not on the ground?
So I don't know about particular studies, but I would give as an example the school in Tennessee in Whitwell, I believe it's called Whitwell, Tennessee, that started the paperclip collection.
Mm-hmm.
I actually went and I visited that school, and I visited them in 2009. And here we are in the middle of Tennessee. You know, I'm driving in to get to the school and I'm seeing Confederate flags everywhere. And I'm thinking, okay, where am I and what have I done? I get to the school's already closed. But the principal was inside and she let me in and she showed me this entire room full of Kiddush cups, Hanukkah menorahs, Shabbos candlesticks, challah boards, like all of these things, because what happened was when they started collecting the paper clips and people started hearing about this little school in the middle of Tennessee that was trying to learn about the Holocaust, the community said, here, let me show you what it means and looks like to be Jewish and what you are actually talking about. And ultimately, they have one of the rail cars sitting in front of their school in Whitwell, Tennessee. And I remember I wrote about it. I sat inside that boxcar, and it was dark outside. And again, I'm in the middle of nowhere, Tennessee. And all I can tell you is that in this community, they learned about the Holocaust and they understood that there are people that are different than them.
I believe that a delegation from Whitwell went on the March of the Living a few years ago.
So cool.
I think that's great. And what a difference it is. Is Holocaust denialism addressed at all in the Colorado curriculum?
We talk about it in the legislative declaration. So the way our laws are written, the legislative declaration is basically the intent or the prose of the legislation, and then you get into the actual legislation components. And one of the reasonings for teaching about the Holocaust is because of the increase in denial activity.
Mm-hmm. So we're kind of running out of time here. There is a few more questions, but one of the questions that I thought was really interesting to ask to you is, what would your message be to future March of the Living participants?
Oh my goodness. Be present. You know, when I look back at my inability to cry, I was walling myself off, right? I couldn't let myself truly believe or understand that I was there. And I hope that any young person or not young person, who is fortunate enough to participate in a future March of the Living understands that this is their moment to actually feel their feet on the ground, look around and see where you are and what you're doing and what happened there. Know it, talk about it, feel it, because it is our story. It doesn't matter how many decades ago it was. It is still our story. And the fact that we have places to continue to go and visit and walk, that may not always be the case. So while we have it now, make sure you have the opportunity and that you experience it.
Yeah, powerful. And I know that when we didn't get to have the march, it was such a loss. You know, obviously the pandemic prevented so many people from attending. So I know that getting back to Poland and teaching those stories and having those moments is so important. So tell us what's on your agenda next, and you know, what's the future for you?
Well, so my agenda when I'm not doing Holocaust education is primarily youth mental health. And right now I'm part of a contingent determining how to spend about $500 million to transform Colorado's behavioral health system. And so that's where a lot of my energy is right now. Right now I like being in the state legislature. So I will, you know, we have term limits. So hopefully I will be able to serve the number of years that are allotted to me for public service, and then we'll see.
Well, we really appreciate everything that you have said here tonight. You've taught us so much about what it means to stand up and to really take activism and put it forward. And we appreciate you for everything that you're doing, both for the state of Colorado and all of us. And I can't thank you enough for the opportunity to talk. You're an inspiration to me, and I know many of the others who are here tonight.
Thank you, Tracy. And yes, your video, your story of March to the Living played in that Indiana hotel ballroom changed my life. So thank you for going on the March to the Living and spending time with me today.
So to everyone who's joined us tonight, if you want to hear further about educational webinars that are offered by International March of the Living, please visit our website, which is motl.org, and follow March of the Living on all of the various social media platforms. We are everywhere. We look forward to everyone joining us for the next event, which will be, I believe, in the near future. Look for postings about that, and we wish everyone a great night, and stay safe, and Shabbat, a good week. So thank you, and shalom to everyone.